Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for watching this evening. This is the Aspen City Council work session for February 26, 2024. We have two items on our agenda this evening. The first one is the GMQS Demolition Allotment Program, and the second one is the Downtowner Service Areas and other items. We'll go ahead and get started right away with GMQS Demolition Allotment Program. Ben is here to introduce this item.
Mr. Mayor and Council, for the record, Ben Anderson, Community Development Director. Continuing conversations that we've had with Council about the GMQS Demolition Allotment System since its inception came into effect in August of 2022. Provided a memo in your packet. I'm happy to revisit any of the points within that memo. But the point of this discussion this evening is to, I think, ultimately follow up with what I understand to be, differing views across council about this program, desires for amendments, changes, heard suggestions of getting rid of the program in its entirety. And I just want to talk with council a little bit about what the process would be should you desire changes, first before we get into anything. We're not going to be making any code amendments this evening. Basically, I'm asking you this evening, one, whether or not you want staff to pursue a policy resolution. Policy resolution is the first step in opening up the land use code. Following a policy resolution that identified specific outcomes that council was desiring within a potential code amendment change, staff would then go out and do, depending on the nature of those proposed changes, appropriate amount of community outreach, and then eventually coming back to council for a first and second reading of an ordinance with any changes that might be proposed in response to council desires around the program. So tonight, I think, just to kind of restate, I'm looking whether there's a majority of council to pursue a policy resolution. And then if that's the case, what are the specific areas within the code that you would desire some staff investigation and putting together proposed amendments related to the program? Current status of the program, 20 allotments have been issued. Technically, only 16 allotments have been issued. Last week, on the 20th, we held our lottery. There were 14 applications, complete and compliant applications that were vying for 4 available 2024 demolition allotments. We'll talk a little bit about that process in just a second. But 16 have technically been issued, and we intend to issue the 4 that were granted during that lottery by the end of this week. No projects have yet been demolished or redeveloped of the allotments that have been issued. We have 3 or 4 projects that should be at the point of building permit issuance in the next few weeks. But we have not seen a single one of these projects demolished or redeveloped. The most recent action that council took on this topic was at the end of 2023 with ordinance number 23, where you implemented the lottery system that staff proposed and granted 2 additional 2024 allotments. That made the 4 available that were available during the lottery held last week. 2 applications, 400 and 410 Lake, remain on appeal in the district court. Although 410 Lake was granted an allotment in the lottery, they reapplied in 2024 and were granted one of the 4 available allotments. And there is 1 application for a 35-year local allotment that will be considered by council at the March 12th regular meeting. At this point in time, staff believes that that project meets the criteria for the 35-year local allotment, but to remind council, that's a decision that ultimately you folks get to make. Any questions about the current status of the program before I move on? Okay. This is the document that we used to keep track of what was happening during the lottery. On the left-hand side of the page are the addresses of, kind of in numerical order, of the projects that submitted complete and compliant applications. There were 14 of them. The representatives on there were more for our use, just so we knew who to look for in the room as the lottery was happening. Jim was present, Mr. True, Nicole Henning was present for the drawing. We used a bingo lottery ball mechanism to identify the numbers. The first thing that we did was randomly assign each of the addresses a number. We then put those balls back into the selection bin and then came up on the right-hand side with the order of the drawn numbers. The 4 projects in yellow were the projects that staff will be issuing notices of approval by the end of this week. And then in order, the other 10 projects that were not in that initial 4 that were selected. Questions about the lottery?
I'm a little unclear. The ones in yellow
are just the reordered projects from the list on the left that were the first 4 that were selected in the lottery drawing.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
So in yellow, those are the 4 that will be issued notices of approval at the end of this week.
Okay, thank you.
Also, on the current status of the program, I think most of you are aware that in addition to the annual limit on the number of allotments, this was the other big part of the program when it was put in place, the residential demolition redevelopment standards. To this point, these remain unchanged from August of 2022. Each of these projects is subject to a waste diversion requirement, participation in the Green Halo program, which is the same program that Pickens County uses to keep track of construction demolition waste, and also diversion of 35% of the project's waste by weight. So the way that these are handled right now is in the notices of approval. These are conditions of approval for the future project, so that when they get to building permit, these outcomes are required of the project. The second is embodied carbon reporting. This is focused because of limitations out in the construction world. We have good numbers and ways to document steel and concrete. Other aspects of the embodied carbon within a building's project is more difficult to report on, but we thought we would stick with what's available out in the industry right now, which is steel and concrete. These projects are required to participate in the Building IQ energy reporting project that we have that right now is only required for commercial and multifamily buildings. This extends for these projects to single family and duplexes. At the time that we passed the demolition program in 2022, following the moratorium, we had not yet adopted the 2021 building codes. And so we put in place some placeholders in anticipation of what the 2021 codes were going to pursue. Projects that are coming through now are subject to the 2021 building codes. And then lastly, the other thing that was required are some enhanced use of best management practices around stormwater management and the urban runoff management plan. These projects are subjected to a higher performance standard in that area. So right now, these are the requirements for projects that get a demolition allotment. And I bring these up because I think in some council discussion that we've had previously, I think there's been some desire to perhaps rethink some of these things, and that could be a topic of discussion or things that staff might look at differently for proposed changes in the future. Again, what I'd be asking for this evening, ultimately from council, is direction to pursue a policy resolution. This, again, it is an action that takes place in a public hearing. It's a resolution that gives direction to staff to open up sections of the land use code. It does require, following that, a public outreach process. In that policy resolution, typically, we identify the specific areas of code for the policies, regulations, and some justification in the recitals as to why we're pursuing these changes. Based on things that I have heard this council say, as we have talked about this program and the evolution of the program, there has been some discussion of expanding the number of the annual allotments. Again, for council's benefit and for members of the public. Initially set at 6. There were 6 issued in 2022, 6 issued in 2023, and then 2 additional issued or granted by council, again, at the end of 2023 for the 2024 allotments, allowing for 8 2024 allotments. With the conclusion of the lottery, those 8 will have been issued. There's been discussion about changing the criteria for getting an allotment. I think that would be around those residential demolition redevelopment standards. There has been discussion about modifying the criteria for getting a long-time local allotment. There has been discussion about giving preference in the allocation of allotments to homes that are of a certain age. Once we implemented the lottery, while we were having that discussion, there was some suggestion about giving a weighted advantage in a future lottery selection to projects that had previously applied but were not selected. Again, we have 10 of those this year, and so there could be some additional weight given to those in the 2025 selection for projects that weren't selected this year. You know, I think we've heard suggestions for incentives for significant renovation projects that do not pursue demolition. Again, we have the 40% threshold that's currently in the code. That 40% does allow a very significant renovation, and would we want to incentivize that further for projects to stay below that 40% threshold? And then there have been statements desiring elimination of the program entirely. So those first 7 are the things that staff has heard council say at the table. But I'd be open to discussing this evening other ideas that were not mentioned in the memo, or staff is not sort of processing at this time. But those are the things that I think areas for possible change. As council's discussing this evening, I'm happy to take questions, discuss any of the sort of individual suggestions about ideas for what that might look like as potential amendments moving forward. But ultimately, this is pretty early on in the process. The policy resolution would give staff the direction to pursue specific amendments and then bring them back to council for your consideration once we've done our work back of house. So again, I'm happy to turn this into a more significant conversation or get into the weeds to the degree the council would like this evening, but ultimately a general statement about whether or not there's a majority of council that desires pursuit of a policy resolution, and then if so, what are those specific areas that council would desire staff to pursue within that policy resolution. Happy to answer any questions. Happy to revisit anything that was in the memo. Happy to talk about current status of the program, should there be questions about that. But with that, I'll turn things over to council for your discussion.
Thanks, Ben. I think the first question for council members is there a desire of council members to make changes to the program as it sits, or are you looking at no changes? And that can just take a straw poll to know whether we should spend another 45 minutes talking about this or not.
Yes.
So yes.
Yes.
Yes, 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 and yes. So yes, we are interested in pursuing policy resolution. And now we can just talk about some different areas that we would like explored and brought back to us. We'll go ahead and start it off. Bill, you want to make comment?
I have questions, comments. I don't need to start, but happy to start though.
Either way. John, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
All right, you start it off.
Okay. I normally don't have a lot to say, so this is going to be a little out of the ordinary for me. I'm going to start my remarks tonight with a well-known maxim in the progressive building world. The greenest building is the one that already exists. Please think about that obvious statement for a moment. Now, the reasoning the demolition permit allotment guidelines the previous council decided to pursue was not only to keep construction and demolition waste out of the landfill, but actually a more far-reaching goal, addressing the decades of complaints and concerns about the never-ending construction and demolition projects, the pace and scale of these projects in virtually every neighborhood in Aspen. I'm not going to share personal stories because I don't need to. Everyone in this room has a personal story. Our municipality does not have many tools to deal with these issues, but this demo allotment program was one. And we did not address this with an arbitrary number. We looked at data over the last 10 to 12 years. The average number was 6 demos per year. It had been gradually ramping up, but that was the average over the last 10 plus years. So the 5 council members at that time decided on 6 per year with 2 more for long-term locals. And currently that's at 65 years or more, which we or future councils can adjust to a lower number if we desire. This is a total of 8 demo permits per year, which is significantly above the average over the last 10 plus years. Now, I've heard that this program is a disaster, a mistake, a failure, petty, a tragedy, wrong. Was it implemented poorly? That depends upon your point of view. But knowing our staff, it was put forth in good faith. This program should be given a chance. I would like to accentuate the fact that of all 20 of the demo allotments issued since the start of this program, not one has actually acted on demolishing or redeveloping. Our previous council voted 5-0 in addressing community concerns over the direction of our community. We were unified in our belief that the rate of demolition was extremely out of balance with local year-round residents' concerns about their quality of life. We have an extremely talented local population filled with architects, planners, builders that have done it all. I feel very strongly with their talent, we have a very good chance of not only repurposing 40% of our built environment, we also continue to set a forward-thinking example for similar communities to follow across Colorado and across our nation. And I'd like to end with that statement again. The greenest building is the one that already exists. Thanks.
John, were there any areas for improvement to the program now that you are considering or you want to just highlight for us?
I think the one thing that I have heard from local residents is that I would consider right off the bat changing is the amount of time, the 35-year.
Okay.
Other than that, I am open to discussion about all of the rest of it, but I stand committed to the purpose of what we tried to accomplish here.
Thank you. Bill?
Thanks. Firstly, thanks to Ben and team for a thorough and easily understood memo. I appreciate it. I want to read a couple of sentences from that memo, Ben, and then ask you some questions. On page 4 in the second paragraph, you write, however, staff remains committed to the concept of the program, believes that it is a fully legitimate response to the issues that council and the community were responding to in declaring the moratorium, and is confident that once demolition allotment projects materialize, that the program will deliver the types of projects and resulting data that the program was intended to produce. And then in the following sentence, underlined, staff is currently satisfied with the status quo. Then on page 6, under the subheading, eliminate the program entirely, you write, 5 years from now, as 15 or more of the allotted demolition projects are complete and have provided a set of examples and connected data on which to evaluate the program, and no tangible benefits are identified, staff would likely be advocates for getting rid of the demolition allotment program. So what I'd like to ask, Ben, is in your view and in staff's view, not necessarily in the view of the past council, but in your view and in staff's view, what isn't explained clearly in the memo or in the presentation tonight is what are the benefits of the program that you're looking for? You talk about getting examples and connected data. I have no idea what the benefits that you're looking for are and therefore why you are optimistic about the future of this program. Could you please explain that from your view?
I can. You know, I think at the time that the moratorium process was happening, we spent an awful lot of time talking to people from broad swaths of the community, folks in the development community, folks not in the development community, local folks who I think, you know, had felt some of these pressures and had very strong feelings about what they were experiencing in their neighborhoods. You know, I think when we heard what council was concerned about and when we heard what the community was concerned about, you know, certainly it was pace and scale of development. Certainly it was the changing nature of homes from, I'm going to use the word modest, older, smaller homes to much different homes that were coming in replacement of those homes that people perceived as modest, smaller, et cetera, that they felt were changing nature of, you know, their neighborhoods. Following construction and certainly during construction, you know, we heard from folks that, you know, were describing, you know, 3 and 4 demo projects on the surrounding blocks around them and the impact that that was having on them. So I think it was certainly the pace of those things. When we looked at our data, that number was ramping up. We, saw some examples of increasingly more recently constructed homes that were being proposed for demolition. I think that when we were thinking about these homes that were coming in the place of, smaller, more modest, maybe less energy efficient homes, I think we were very interested at the time in getting data about construction and demolition waste, what was being produced in the home by these demolition and redevelopment projects. I think as we tried to understand the delta between sort of these existing homes and the new homes that were being put in place, that was the purpose of that embodied sort of energy reporting, of trying to understand, whether or not the thing that John just said, the sort of, the existing home is the greenest home. Is that true? I've seen evidence, yes, but I think there's also, clear evidence that, new constructed homes are more energy efficient, but does that take into account the materials that go into the landfill, the new materials that are going into the house? So we were trying to understand that dynamic. Certainly we wanted these new homes to be subject to sort of a heightened building code at the time, hadn't been passed yet. Engineering, increasingly as projects were building setback to setback, engineering clearly, I think, had the experience that more and more homes were, proposing the use of dry wells and other, significant infrastructure in treating stormwater. And so that was the purpose of that project. So, or for that aspect of the standards. And so I think it was a whole host of things. And I think, to be honest as well, as we sort of evaluated the conversation that was happening in the community, the conversation was happening at city council table, the conversation we're having with the development community, there's only so many levers in the land use code, right? And to respond to these kinds of things that are, people are suggesting are tugging at community character. And, we felt that this was a targeted response to these larger concerns that the community was having that didn't then translate into us going and lopping off floor area, going and lopping off subgrade, going and lopping off other things that perhaps could have resulted in some of the same outcomes that people were concerned about. This seemed to be an alternative to that directly responded to the things that we heard from the community about.
Thanks for that explanation. Not sure it addressed my question, so let me rephrase the question in a different way. In here you talk about looking back 5 years from now. So if I am looking back, if we fast forward 5 years from now, can you please tell me what the list of the benefits I'm going to be looking for, or lack thereof, is? Succinctly tell me what those benefits are going to be to the community of Aspen.
I can. The data that comes out of the reporting requirements, I think is crucial for us.
Which reporting requirements?
For construction and demolition waste, diversion, that Green Halo program, and the embodied energy reporting. Like, those two things are important for us as we think about redevelopment scenarios moving forward and what the impacts are in the landfill and what the impacts are for sort of our larger commitments to sort of climate action. I think we did really good work in the building code to get new buildings to be even higher performing. That's something that's going to happen regardless. But I also think that anytime you limit something like this, and it was the whole basis for the growth management program when it was put in place to begin with. If you look at the purpose statements, and I rattled them off in the memo, that whole program was set up to respond to, whether it was feeling or whether it was truth, the community was feeling like there was too much development pressure in town. when the program was put in place and the whole concept of allotments came in for, all the other development types that the community experiences. And so looking at those purpose statements and looking at the impact of these projects and the growing pressure on these kinds of projects in neighborhoods, the number of them that are happening, the scale and size of them that are happening, I do think that there's going to be, and it might be the truth, and it might just be the way people feel, that 5 years from now, if people feel like this program is pacing that to a degree that feels manageable to the community, and that the projects that are coming out of that are high-performing, and, those are the kinds of things that sort of I'm thinking about.
Okay, thanks. So I think I heard two things there.
Yeah.
I think I heard data about the amount of waste going to the dump, to put it in layman's terms. Is
Yep.
that right? And I think I heard a feeling for the community on what the appropriate pace of residential reconstruction is. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I'd say the third thing, out of the embodied energy reporting, and I think that that's in its sort of infancy in the industry, but I do think that as we try to understand the dynamics that are associated with tearing down a modest house and putting up a differently scaled house that's of a much different complexity, a much different size, much different sort of subgrade space, understanding ultimately what the trade-offs are between that old house and the new house. I think that's also important.
Okay, great. So on the second point regarding pace, do you think that this communicated, that we as a council and this community are sophisticated enough to imagine ourselves 5 years from now and talk about how 6 demolitions per year feels?
I think when the whole allotment system came into place, it was aspirational, and I think it was the way that the community decided to respond to what the community was feeling. I do think that part of it is you can put date on it, but I also think that, you look at the statements from the late 70s as the community was contemplating this whole system that got put in place eventually. Granted, it's much more complicated today than it was in 1977. In some ways it was more complicated then. But I do think that it's ultimately, when the community landed on its growth rate that the community was comfortable with, it set the basis for those allotment numbers. I do think a lot of it, there was projections, there were studies, but I think it was ultimately what does the community feel comfortable with, what feels right? And I do think that that's part of it.
No, I understand that, and there's a fundamental conversation that needs to be contemplated by everybody of whether replacing one dwelling unit with one dwelling unit is growth or if it's just construction, which I believe to be a healthy part of any economy in any community. I want to switch gears a little bit, Ben, to address something that Mr. Doyle said, that the greenest building is the one that exists. And I'm wondering if you could help me paint a picture for those that are paying attention about what a sub 40% heavy renovation project looks like. I'm not sure everyone understands that.
Yeah.
And of course, you're going to have to use some artistic license here because each project's different. But if one, let's contemplate the scenario that someone purchases a very dated home, let's say 40 or 50-year-old home. They'd like to, let's say all of the floor area on that site is not currently used.
Okay.
Let's say that they would like to completely renovate as much of this project as they could.
Okay.
Under that under the 40% rule. Could you briefly talk about what sort of things they could do to this project and can't do to the project? And what that construction looks like and what the changes to the project look like, please?
Sure. No, just to say clearly, with the 40% demolition threshold on a renovation, you can make a new house, right? When we say 40%, we're roughly talking about the exterior surface areas of the building above grade. And so you gotta stay underneath that 40%. You could change, significant portions of the wall structure and the roof structure. You could, up to 40%. Certainly we're talking new windows. Certainly, we're probably talking new exterior siding. We're probably talking about a new insulation wall assembly, kind of internal walls. You know, I think you could do an addition to your subgrade. I think you could put in certainly new mechanical systems. You could put in, you know, kitchen renovations, bath renovations to your desire, those kinds of things. And certainly expand that property up to its allowable floor area. So I don't think I would ever suggest that, you know, those projects don't have some trade-offs of some of the things that we were trying to sort of moderate with this whole sort of program, because they do. They're significant projects. But I do think that the materials that do remain, the 60% of the wall surfaces that do remain, when you're doing these kinds of projects, it's less likely that you're completely reconfiguring your subgrade. So we're talking about a heck of a lot less concrete, perhaps, you know, perhaps. So there's no argument for me that those are not insignificant projects as well. I will say also, it's one of the things that we don't understand very well. And it's part of that, like, data around demolition construction waste that we're trying to get at and understanding, I think, projects of all kinds. These were the first to go on trial. And then those trade-offs within that embodied energy reporting. Like, those are two important data points so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we can go, hey, you know what? This isn't as big a deal as we thought it was, and a modern home that's, you know, 50% more efficient and 30% larger than the other home is actually a better deal for the community. I don't know that right now. There's conflicting evidence out in the industry about that, but I think in general, I tend to agree with the comment that John made, just because I understand the significant energy that's present in those construction materials, both in the existing and the new.
Thanks. Would you agree with the statement that in this imaginary scenario we were just describing, the majority, meaning greater than 50%, of the materials used to construct the existing structure are likely to end up being demolished and removed?
If you're up against that 40%, likely.
Would you also agree with the statement that in this type of imaginary project, the construction duration could easily be as long as demolishing and constructing a new home?
I think depending on what they were doing in the subgrade.
But it's totally feasible, right? It's not like you're saying by doing this, this is a half duration.
Yeah, I don't think I could make a statement contrary to that.
I think I'm good for now. Thank you so much, Ben, for your answers.
Thanks, Bill. More questions or comments, and while you're making them, if there are specific areas that you're looking for change, then.
Yeah, I have that written at the end. So comments first. So I find this policy to be pretty anti-local in a sense, and it hurts. I'm going to use her name, Chrissy Popes of the world. She did not win the lottery. We've seen her in tears at your seat. And right now, you know, we denied an application for one in an appeal, and it won the lottery this time around, so it wasn't based off of anything other than criteria, which it clearly met. So that just seems obtuse to me as far as how that goes. And then Chrissy's home is energy inefficient. We've talked about that in great length. So when these homes were built, a lot of them, I don't know, like she talks about like the repairs and upkeeps that she needs. Like we're almost forcing her to keep her home, to sell it at a lower price. Like it's a very tyrannical situation we put her in. I don't understand why we prevent demolitions on one side and then leave energy inefficient homes on the other side, especially when we talk about the greening of buildings and how buildings here are the greatest contribution to greenhouse gases. That doesn't make any sense to me. No other municipality in Colorado has this policy. So some might call it bold, but for me, I call it a mistake. And I think we've already learned that here. And this clearly was made because of an abnormality called COVID. This policy would not be in place if it wasn't for the 20 demolition permits that were asked for in 2020 when COVID hit. So it was a jerk reaction, and I respect that in the sense that there's a lot of fear at that time. At the same time, it makes no sense to me to implement policy and use hope as a strategy that it's going to change. I also feel like this is sort of a tyranny of the majority sort of situation where this policy really just sticks it to free market homeowners for, once again, hope and data as a strategy. I don't really get it on that side of things. So if it were up to me, I would eliminate this policy and work on things like waste diversion and be more targeted in the solutions. And we already have a lot of these in place. I mean, we have policy to make a home energy efficient. We have policy to make sure it's built the right way. We are working towards things like waste diversion. So this policy just seems completely unnecessary. If we're not going to eliminate it tonight, then at the very minimum, especially as you talk about like maybe this program only goes on for 5 more years, or maybe only goes on for 1 more year, depending on how elections go. But I would do lottery, and then losers get permit down the line to at least grant certainty to people. And then I would also lower the long-time local age limit. As far as any of the other stuff that has been suggested, I think it just creates more hoopla and unnecessary red tape for people. But hopefully this policy is eliminated sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Board comments, input, and some highlights of areas that you're interested in making program changes.
Yeah, Bill, I first have to ask for full transparency and disclosure. Are any of the demolition permits that are before, that were in the system, are any of those, do you have a financial interest in any of those?
Yes, I've previously disclosed at this seat that I have applied for a demo allotment, one of the very first ones. I was granted one, and that my opinion of eliminating this program probably hurts me financially because I have what has been created as this false commodity. So I'm in possession of one of these demolition allotments.
I understand that, the 433 Gillespie.
That's correct.
Are there other ones that you have a financial interest in?
None.
Okay, thank you for the clarification on that. I would like, first of all, I think, obviously there's been a change in councils. There are 2 members on this council that were not members when this ordinance was originally enacted. And I think that what we need to do is look back, what we as all members of the current council need to look back at what the clauses and the whereas clauses of Ordinance 13, 2021, I think it was, that are 2022, and to ask each of us to evaluate and see if we agree with those conditions and conclusions, if they hold validity, and to weigh everything going forward against the answers to your reactions to those whereas clauses, because I think that reflects pretty well what what the previous council with staff worked through over an extended period of time. It was Councilman Rose projects that the only cause of this was COVID. That might be, but we have no way of verifying that. It's a projected cause. We do know what was going on at the time is that there was a tremendous increase in building activity, demolition activity, the change in the character of homes in residential areas becoming, in essence, short-term rentals, mini hotels, and that had what the council at the time determined were detrimental effects on the character of the neighborhoods. And our council being the one previous council, after considerable consideration considered and decided that this was an action that could stem the tide or could put that back in control. And I think it was out of balance. I think Councilman Rose indicated there were 20 demolition approvals, I think 17 or 20. There were a lot of them in that period of time. The average over a period of time that we determined was 6, and that's the number we chose. I don't think there's anything nefarious about the intention of the ordinance, and indicating that there was is, I think, off target. I don't think there was any us against them, and I don't think that there was any anti-local bias on the implementation of this ordinance. Councilman Doyle mentioned that we're limited on what we can do. We considered such things as limiting the floor area ratio, limiting the subgrade space that could be allowed. There were a number of different things approaches that we considered, and this is what we landed on, and this is what we are facing tonight and asking to have lessons learned from the last 2 years or so, and what we may want to make adjustments on. For me, I would like to see consideration for the ownership and occupancy requirements of 35 years. I would also like to consider having more advanced qualifications to seek demo allotments. Councilman Rose back in December 12th of 2023 said that it was a commoditization of the process, and I think that that's perhaps true, that there were applications made with no real future plans for development, and that they were done to perhaps increase their position in the real estate market. So if we are going to continue this program, I would like to consider having further land use definition before a demolition permit is accepted, and to try to remove that speculative nature of getting a demolition permit. I would also like to see additional weight for prior years of attempted and failed attempts to win a lottery. I think that I'd like to discuss the age of the structure, perhaps just if it's 15 years old, you get an extra ball in the lottery, something to give an added weight for older structures, 40, 50, 60 years old. I appreciate Councilman Rose's comments both back in December and tonight about being concerned about energy efficiency as a goal for this. I think certainly that the energy codes that we have in effect now are very cognizant of energy efficiency. It's the older buildings that are really in question. But CoA is available for some of those energy efficiency grants. And at the last meeting in my comments, and I will point to Paul Anderson's a series of articles by Aspen Journalism that that gets at the question, and in the memo it's decided that staff has difficulty deciding or understanding what a local is. And I suggest that it's something that it might be different for all of us, and what we can't define is still there. And do we as a council have a duty to try to uphold the character, the fabric, and the spirit of Aspen for whatever that is? And is it the duty of a local government to try to intervene and protect what the community feels is a loss of that character, the fabric or the spirit? So that gets to a basic question, and I address this to mostly Bill and Sam because they weren't on the council at the time, but what is the role of government? Is this a role that we should not be involved in at all? Is this a role that we as government have a right or a duty to be involved in to try to control rate of growth, character of the neighborhood, and to weigh that in your decisions as we look at this policy resolution and perhaps amendments to this going forward. And just a final mention of the balance between community and commodity. Every time that we lose, I think, local residents, members of the workforce, we're affecting the sustainability of our tourist economy. And we suffer a loss in the character, I think, of this community when we lose some of that, and it's at the expense of profit for some other sectors, and that's not something that any individual can say, this is right, this is wrong. It's not a dualistic world. We live in Technicolor. We have to make decisions with nuances and try to look forward as much as we can. We don't have the benefit of 5 years. Nobody knows what it's going to be like 5 years from now, nor did we know what it was going to be like 3 years or 2 years from the time that we made a decision. All we could do is, with the best information at hand and available to us, do the best we could to address a problem that we had identified. So I think that outlines what I would be interested in. Thank you.
Thanks, Ward. Appreciate that. Ben, I have a couple maybe questions, but one primarily, because I see this as dealing with a lot of different issues. And maybe some of those are not best to be dealt with here, can be dealt with in other areas of the land use code. But can you just talk to, when we talk about construction activity, the amount? We have a GMQS system, growth management quota system. And in that, I believe it sets forth caps for number of new units or new square footage allocated across residential or commercial and the like. Does that only pertain to new development? So a scrape and replace house does not qualify in there, or just new, if there was additional square footage or such in a project, does that fall under GMQS?
So for single-family and duplex residential, actually, let's just say residential in general, based on the growth rate that it was identified long ago by the city for what an acceptable rate of growth, there were 19 residential allotments allowed on an annual basis. Because Aspen's built out, there's not, so let me back up a second. There is an assumption within the land use code as the GMQS system was created, and it's one of the reasons why the GMQS system is essential to the land use code, because it has tentacles every place. But there's an assumption that every single existing lot in the city of Aspen, residential lot, has an allotment associated with it. And so those 19 allotments that were put into GMQS were for new lots. So if you subdivided or you created a new, 5 new lots, those 5 new lots would be subtracted from that 19 annual allotments. The other place where you could use those 19 annual allotments are in multifamily. We haven't built any new multifamily market rate market rate housing for a long time in this community. Affordable, yes. Market rate, no. And, I've been with the city about 8 years now. A trend that I noticed pretty quickly after coming to the city was that not only in residential, but in commercial and lodge, the other places that we have these allotments, we weren't using any of these things. And yet, when we got to the discussion at the moratorium, we've never seen so much construction in town. What's going on? Does the allotment system even work at all? And so I will say a significant origin of the use of the annual residential allotments as the basis for this demolition allotment program was when we looked at construction activity and we looked at what was going on, there wasn't new commercial, for the most part. We've got some impactful projects in town right now. We, at the time, you know, we hadn't really used lodge allotments very much. Gorsuch House and Lift One Lodge changed that a little bit. There was a couple years where they used all the allotments that were available. But for the most part, we were getting all of this feedback, I think both at the council table, certainly during the moratorium discussions, like, my goodness, town's never felt busier from a construction perspective. Our numbers in terms of permits, our, you know, valuations in terms of permits were, you know, continuing to creep up, and yet we weren't using this one tool that we had in the land use code to kind of put a handle on this stuff. So I will say that that's part of where the whole idea came from. So in the commercial sector, if you were to add some square footage of commercial space, those get counted in the annual allotments. But if you're, you know, prior to the demolition allotment system, if you were tearing down a house and putting up a new house, it had zero impact on the allotment system.
Thank you. My next question would be about the lottery that just happened. You said 14 completed and accepted applications. Do you know, did you look at kind of who those applicants were, what those projects were? Meaning, when we talk about the longtime local allotment or exemptions, whatever you want to call it, did you look at it, at those 14 in any of those respects? Like, did you learn anything from the applications for the lottery that just happened?
I know a little bit about some of them. I don't know that I know about all of them comprehensively. You know, two of the projects were projects that were previously denied allotments from appeal. I do know that there are two in that list of 14 that probably clearly qualify for longtime locals. Ms. Pope's project was in that list. I think she landed on number 6. But I will say the biggest thing, and I think this is to Ward's point that was just made a few minutes ago, I think when we initially envisioned this, I think that there was an understanding that projects, you know, someone pursuing one of these projects wouldn't have a fully designed project that they were contemplating, but they would have been sort of down the design road a little bit. And so they would have a site plan. They would have some sort of other defining characteristics of their homes that they could submit at the time that they were, you know, putting forward for one of these demolition allotments. Now, I will say that in lots of things that we do down in ComDev, we know that developers and homeowners, they're not going to invest in a ton of design work that's very expensive and increasingly expensive unless they've got some certainty around development outcomes that they've got entitlements to. And so, you know, I don't think we were ever expecting a robust set of, you know, a fully designed home at the point at which they were submitting for a demolition allotment. But I will say, other than the first few that came in 2022, by and large, most of the applications that we're getting, and this goes back to the ones that we received last year, they're all proposing demolition and taking the property back to Greenfield, which means that it's not in preparation for a future design. It's an entitlement that's going along with a probably likely future real estate transaction that then allows the new purchaser to design. That is one trend that I do think is true of this most recent batch of applications, and certainly goes back to the applications that we received last year. I would say the ones that came in 2022, many of them, and I think part of it clearly is there were projects that were already being contemplated that got held up by the moratorium when it was declared, that a lot of those initial applications were further down along the design road than the applications that we've received in the last, you know, let's say 12 months.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple of primary concerns, and I want to share these with council members as well as staff. You know, the C&D diversion is something that's really important to me. You know, landfill life, resource allocation and use is something that's very important to me. A concern of mine is the change from occupied residences to investment properties. You know, being in Aspen, we have pressures from global wealth. We are not your average or typical neighborhoods or city in the sense that the money that is able to invest here has a direct relationship to the percentage of free market residences that are lived in versus investment property, vacation, second, third home type stuff. And that's a concern to me. Right now, we've been told that our free market residential properties are lived in at about, I want to say 32%. I think it was 68% were not primary residences. And I see that I can only imagine that getting worse, which means for me, fewer people living in the actual residences that we have available in our community. And I think that's a bad thing because it erodes our community base, and that has a lot of impacts on whether it's schools and services or workforce. So that is a concern of mine. Another concern of mine are the growth and the employee generation impacts that we see happen when properties are demoed and new properties are going up. They seem to be more intensive, and I don't mean growth in the sense, like, Bill, how you allude to it of it. It's not more building, but it's growth in perhaps service needs. That's the way I'm talking about it. It's just more pressure on that, down valley commuter workforce that we've relied on for so long, but we're also seeing being less available to us. Current studies have shown us that it is just not the same dynamic for our valley as it used to be. So those are just a couple of the issues that come to me when I look at why we're doing this. And I'll go back to my first statement was, like, I don't think that this is the program to kind of approach or attack some of those issues. So with that, for me, the number one thing that I'm looking for here is greater waste diversion. I do think that we should increase the construction and demolition waste diversion rate. Somebody shared an example from Boulder, Colorado, of 75% of waste diversion. Now, that doesn't have to just be reuse. I'm just saying that the Pickens County landfill is seeing impacts that will, in the future, impact all residents. So for me, diversion is really just comes down to that. It is how much is being deposited in our landfill. Do I want reuse? Absolutely. But I recognize that, what's most important is the landfill life and what's filling it up. So for me, I look at the opportunity for us to increase the diversion rate as something that we should do. I would love to see a policy resolution that starts talking about that for land use code changes. I also do share in what other council members have said about the longtime local allotments. I would like to see that go down from 35 years at a minimum to 25 years. I could see it even being at 20 years, but that kind of gives me a little bit of comfort against pure speculative property buying. I understand if somebody's here for 20 years and it's time for a change and their property is aged, I get it. I wouldn't want to stand in the way of that. But what I do want to have some sort of safeguard around is just an open market for any and all properties to be purchased, demoed, and changed in use from residential to investment properties. So I, along with other council members, have are voicing support for some changes to that long-time local allotment. For me, that also means that it could be greater than just 2 a year. And the reason I asked Ben the question about what he saw in this last lottery application process was because if we were to allow more properties of residents of 20 or 25 years, that would reduce the number of applicants in a general lottery for demo permits. So I think that that can have two beneficial effects. One is honoring and respecting locals, but also then creating some room in that demo program. So I think that's something that many council members up here are supportive of. I thought that Sam had an interesting input of some additional lottery certainty if the lottery is to continue, that for those that applied and were not granted in a process, that they then get not only more chances in a following lottery, but an end to that of maybe 3 years. You know, I can see some improvements in the lottery process for more certainty. So I am in favor of making changes to this program. I don't support complete elimination of it until other mechanisms are put in place to safeguard against some of the negative impacts that we've seen, our community has seen. So, you know, coming in here, or actually last week as I was preparing for this, I've shared with many of you a couple times that for me, if we just simply put in 75% diversion rate, I almost don't need a demo programming cap. Because to me, that takes care of my primary concern, I think our community's primary concern. And there's other ways to deal with some of the other items that are on the list of negative community impacts. But sitting through this, I recognize that 75% diversion rate really only attacks one part of this. So I'm looking at some other improvements to this program. I'm not supportive of completely eliminating the program, but I do think that there are some other mechanisms that can create better fairness and equity for many of the different applicants and user groups that are trying to use this. You know, I don't think that we are going to completely change the nature of Aspen's development and redevelopment. That's not my ambition or goal here. I really am looking for something that addresses community concerns. And like I said, I'm very interested in diversion rates, long-time local allotments, lottery certainty, and a few other changes and tweaks to this that I think makes it work best. In the future, I can see, as Ben said in his memo, hey, if we're seeing the returns to the community and there is a level of comfort on all sides, then maybe we don't need a program. But I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think we'll know that for a couple years. So that's where I'm at. I want to go back to council members. There are a couple things that we're putting on the table for Ben as a policy resolution, which is signaling council members' desires for certain areas of improvement to the program. Bill.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to address those specifically, and I have a few follow-up questions. Tori, you mentioned this idea of lived-in homes and what feels like less lived-in homes or fewer lived-in homes than historically. You know, in my 14 years in Aspen, anecdotally, it feels like quite the opposite is happening right now, certainly in a post-COVID era. I'm wondering if we have any data on the actual full-time year-round occupancy of our free market dwelling units or not, because anecdotally to me, it feels like quite the opposite. Particularly, let's use the West End neighborhood as an example, which I'm most familiar with. There are a lot more lights on in May than there ever have been in my 14 years here. So that's just one. I don't know if that data exists or not.
it's hard number, those are hard numbers to get at. I mean, I think in the past, we've relied pretty heavily on census data, and, you know, the American Community Surveys updates between the 10-year decennial measures, but they're hard numbers to get at. Anecdotally, you know, I think during COVID, the Northwest COG and the put together a report that I think tried to analyze some of the trends coming out of COVID, but they're really hard numbers to get at reliably. I think there's been some efforts sort of locally to pull apart, voting records and that kind of thing to see trends in neighborhoods and that kind of stuff, but they're numbers that are difficult to get at. Anecdotally, may or may not be true.
Yeah. I think even if you could get at some of that data that you were talking about, Ben, there's a skew in Aspen particularly because a lot of people have very complex tax situations, don't want to change their voting from wherever they may have moved from, don't change their vehicle registrations, right. Don't change their driver's license, don't change their where they file their income taxes. Right. So I think that because of sort of the demographics of our free market population, that data is likely to be skewed even if you were able to get it. So again, all I've got to go on because there is no data is my personal experience, and I feel like quite the opposite has happened. So I disagree with that premise.
And Bill, I would just say, what we've seen over decades has been a decline in that area. Has it taken an uptick over COVID? Yeah, I think that some people did move here. A lot of the ones that I talk to aren't here full year. They are here part-time, but they are here. And so I think you're right. I think there's more lights on. I don't disagree with that. But in the overall picture of what we're talking about older homes being scraped and replaced, I know countless homes that, used to house 4 or 5 local employees that no longer do. So I appreciate what you're saying. It's almost maybe splitting hairs, but if there were zero demo program, if there was no growth management quota system, if there was no safeguard around this, I can only say that I think it's safe to say that the market in Aspen lends itself more to non-lived-in properties than lived-in properties.
Yeah, but again, I think that has recently changed. And I think it's also important to balance the fact that a lot of deed-restricted housing units have been created during that period of that shift.
Absolutely.
A lot.
Thank God.
So, again, I'm not criticizing it. To be perfectly clear, I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that's the reality of it, that as free market units have become more expensive and some of those local housing patterns have shifted, we've balanced that over time here. And so we are housing as many, in my opinion, in my gut, as many, if not more, full-time year-round residents than we ever have after the mining days, probably. That's what my gut tells me.
Could I weigh in for a
I got
second on
a
this?
few more things. Thanks. Tori, you talked about the construction and demolition diversion rates. I just want to confirm with Ben that those could be changed in our land use code outside of this demolition allotment program. There's other mechanisms and places to enact that.
Yes. This program was, I think an experiment for the city getting into following the lead of Pickens County around their diversion program, also using that Green Halo program. I will say that, we're down in ComDev, we have staff actively working on expanding this program to some degree to sort of all building permits, similar to Pickens County's program. So yeah, absolutely, probably wouldn't live in the land use code, would probably live in the construction management plan or building code.
Thank you. One more general comment, and then I want to sort of wrap up my thoughts for areas of possible change. I want to acknowledge that this demolition allotment program further increases the cost of housing and creation of housing in Aspen. And I'm not just talking about a free market house that was $6 million and is now $8 million or $10 million, which some of you may not sympathize or empathize with. But this trickles to everything. It affects the cost of creating new affordable housing. It affects the cost of rent of free market housing. It affects everything. And by restricting supply and by tinkering with free market mechanics, there is a real cost to our community in terms of how much housing costs. And I want to acknowledge that and want others to understand and hear that I realize that. So to address your specific question, areas for possible change, Ben, if it's not obvious and clear, I know I've stated it before, but I'm in favor of eliminating this program, not because I don't sympathize and empathize with many of the whereas statements that were on Ordinance 13. I do. I just don't think that this solves for any of them. I don't understand where the benefits are going to be for our community. I think it's actually going to cause more problems than it solves. I think it's addressing the wrong issues. You know, Tori mentioned one that's important to him: construction and demolition diversion rates. Pretty simple to solve for that. I think there's a lot of ways to solve for the various issues that are being felt without this mechanism, which causes more harm than good, in my opinion. If we were to keep it, I think I would prefer increasing the number of allotments, number one. Number two, I would prefer exempting homes of a certain age. I do understand your point that you mentioned in the memo, Ben, about your parents' mid-century home, and respect that. I happen to love mid-century architecture. I think Aspen Modern's program and incentive structure partially, if not entirely, addresses that already, and provides for an avenue to encourage people to maintain those few. And I think there are very few structures of that era in our community that are honestly worth saving. Really a small handful come to mind for me. And Aspen Modern has worked for them even before this. So that program has not been mentioned or discussed, at least in my time up on this board revolving this subject, but it's a great program, and it works, and it gives people a reason to keep those existing structures and not tear them down, or can do so at least. And the last thing is, I have a really tough time with this long-time local exemption, and I know, Ben, it gives you a lot of pause also. You know, what we haven't talked about specifically is, you know, what happens if someone moves houses, sells their house, still a longtime member of the community, but maybe their family size changed, maybe their financial picture changed. There's all sorts of reasons why someone may trade from one house to another, and they're being penalized for that versus someone who stayed in their house, in the same house. It's just not fair to me. It doesn't make any sense. The age of a home is a much more unbiased criteria to me. I feel like this long-time local thing opens up to a lot of liability, criticism. Just doesn't feel right to me, and it also opens up the question of what is a local, which you mentioned in your memo, Ben. It's not for me to decide what a local is. It's for everyone else to decide. If you move here and you think you're a local, you're a local. It's not for someone who's lived here for a long time and says that they get to make that decision on what the criteria is. It's up to each individual to decide where they live and what place they want to call home. Not for any of us. So I think that sums it up. Big favor of eliminating, or I'm highly in favor of eliminating, but if we're going to keep it, I think let's work on the age of the structures as an unbiased, tangible criteria. Let's increase the number of allotments. Let's get rid of this long-time local concept. It's not right.
Thanks, Bill. Okay. Moving forward, you need for a policy resolution to be specific about areas that we want to look at.
I think I heard enough direction this evening to get started on that. Again, we're a long way from making decisions on any of this stuff, and I can, come back at a policy resolution and ask more pointed questions to see if there's, at that point, majority support. I will say one topic, and I didn't bring this up in the memo, but just based on some comments that were just made and attachment or relationship to other comments heard earlier this evening. you know, again, because of ownership arrangements that are present in this town, probably more so than in other communities, it's really hard for staff, and then I think to make recommendations to you folks about, you know, has a family owned a property for 35 years. I will say one of the things that sort of is attached to that we've heard a lot from are, you know, people who have lived in town for a long time, might have a property as an investment property that they don't actually live in. But I've also heard it from folks that have owned homes as you know, vacation rental or, you know, vacation homes for their family for decades, who have pursued one of these that, you know, have not been able to meet the residency requirement that's also sort of tied to that. You don't need to make a decision this evening, but just know that that's one other topic that I do think, as we're thinking about giving any kind of exemption or special framing within the program, like that's a topic that we've heard a lot about from staff of, you know, representatives of folks that have, and, you know, you folks granted a couple of appeals to properties that were in this status of, you know, properties that have been in families for a few decades. Kids are moving on, maybe not interested in having, you know, the same experience as their parents and you know, wanting to sell their property. So anyway, just know that that's part of the thinking about that too, is trying to sort of rectify that, because we have heard quite a bit about that from different applicants.
Is there a slide 2 for this?
Yes.
That's 5 of them. There's three others.
Yeah, you know, I think really the one that's on here is that I don't know that if I heard sort of you know, significant support from, or even more than maybe a brief mention, is do we want to do more around projects that do significant renovations but stay under that, you know, the demolition threshold? You know, there's only, again, so many tools that we have: expedited building permits, building permit fees, affordable housing mitigation fees. I mean, there's, like, you know, the list of incentives that we have around this, you know, are fairly limited. But I will say that that's been something that's been floated around, is do we want to do things to encourage more projects not to cross over that threshold? And if, you know, I think there's areas that, you know, we've got a really solid building code. We've got folks working on construction and demolition waste for projects that don't cross that threshold. But that's the one that I don't know that I've heard any comments on this evening, but I have heard mentioned previously.
Board has some additional comments. Bill, as he was talking through that, I think I saw your head shaking no. Are you number 6 that's bulleted there? Does that not make sense to you?
It doesn't make sense to me because I just don't think that it solves for anything.
not the right-
I don't dislike the idea, but what does it solve for? It's you know, these, like I was trying to help everyone understand tonight, and if you understand it already, maybe I'm just reinforcing it, but these sub 40% projects, if someone wants a new house, are not less intensive to the community.
Right.
They're not. It's, I think, equivalent construction. In some cases, it could be longer and more complex construction. You know, you're working around an existing building. You know, what comes to mind is this Snowmass Center project where they want them to redevelop the entire Snowmass Center and keep Clark's Market and the post office open. It doesn't work, to put it bluntly. So that's why I'm shaking my head. I don't dislike the idea of incentivizing, very much the opposite. I just don't know what it solves
Right.
for.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Ward?
Yeah, Ben, I need some clarification or clarity on the GMQS. You mentioned that it had no impact demo allotment process for a scrape and replace. And then what is the impact post? I know I heard Bill question whether a scrape and replace is growth. It's still not considered growth, is it?
So the way that we set it up at the time Ordinance 13 was passed is that those 6 demolition allotments were subtracted from the 19 residential allotments that were sort of existing in GMQS at the time. You know, I will say, sort of parallel to this conversation, you know, staff's working on our response to Senate Bill 1255, which precluded communities from having a growth management system. And, you know, Councilmember Guth and I have had this conversation multiple times about what sort of constitutes growth. And, you know, the states put forward their version of growth within 1255, and we're, you know, thinking about how it relates to particularly this program, but sort of across residential allotments, because that's really what it was targeting. It doesn't have much impact on commercial or lodge. And so I do think there's question about that, Ward, and I think people have different perspectives on that. I think the states, recent passage of 1255, they've got a perspective on what that means, and I think we're going to have to do some work to figure out how or if, you know, this program sort of fits into our response to 1255.
Then a comment on, you know, lights on in the West End. For a long time, we were trying to get the lights on in the West End, and now apparently there are more lights on. And I think that a better measure of the impact is, you know, how much water, how much more demand is there on water in the school district, and job creation to me means more than just people living in the community or lights on in the community. And I agree with Bill. I think number 6, we could address it, but I don't think I think it should be removed from this and addressed as a separate issue. And I sense that Sam might be supportive of this, not to project what Sam thinks, but his previous support for energy efficiency, I think, and his involvement with CoA might tend to have him supportive of this as well. And I won't speak for him, but I think that it's a good idea to incentivize, but this isn't the place for it.
John?
Yeah, I just want to say I also agree with what Tori said about Boulder's diversion rates, and if staff could take a closer look at that, there might be something helpful.
We definitely are.
Awesome, thanks.
So it looks like your list of 8, the first 5 are all things that we're interested in looking at. You know, again, like I said, I mean, I think there is something that we need to land on, and hopefully we can put some, you know, lighter touch safeguards in. I don't know what you want to call them, but maybe the program as it exists does not need to be in existence in 5 years from now. You know, it's interesting that we just had this conversation at this table again about the fact that we discussed reducing floor area and the like. And I think the previous council recognized that that might have been an area that would have been even more sensitive to development community. And so we chose not to go that way. But maybe this council sees other avenues for land use code amendments that get us to the places we want to be on these. And like I said at the beginning, not all of these are appropriately handled in this area. So thank you so much.
Yeah, just in terms of next steps, staff will return to council in a public hearing with a policy resolution kind of outlining potential changes. And then we'll get to working on, you know, what that looks like in terms of potential modifications of land use code.
You know, and it's, I don't want to put this ahead of everything else, but it sounded like there was more support for changes to the longtime resident allotments. And I'm wondering if those have the opportunity to come forward sooner than later.
Yeah, I think I probably would, you know, one response could be that we do a single policy resolution, and then perhaps multiple ordinances, or at least a couple of ordinances to respond to different issues, but I sort of understand that.
Great, thank you. Is there any other questions or clarifications that you need or want to make sure that Ben has?
I think we're good. The one thing I just want to mention on timing, we're still, the earliest we'll be back is the end of March with that policy resolution. It might even be the first meeting in April.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Kevin.
All right, we have one more item on our agenda this evening, so everybody can take just a few minutes and then we'll get switched over. Need a bio break, now's your time. Oh, is that right?
You too.
That's it? I'm just a note taker. An item and gone, huh? All right, Kevin. Have a good night. Jeff, good to see you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Who are those people in the front? As we look at it.
Professional. Thank you.
Jeff's show.
That's Jeff Show from then, his girl, I forget her name, I know her, but I don't forget.
Oh, we've been doing that name, and I've never been to the face on Jeff's show.
And then, you know, his dad was Papa Shof, the guy that walked around with the walking stick and the dog.
Sam Caddell's the one that's the most.
Out of here?
That
Okay,
ad
so
was
this is
right
September.
there.
Jeff Schiff was my very first campaign donator,
Really?
2003,
Good.
$25.
That's not a bad thing.
Very first person that I supported
Good, how are you?
effort like that. Good. All right. Pete, if you want to introduce.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council, for having this discussion with us tonight. I'm Pete Rice with Lynn Runbaugh, our Mobility Division Manager, and we're with the Transportation Department to discuss microtransit. We'll take about 10 minutes, and we're going to start with a specific strategy that are underway that we wanted to kind of relight again, that we are looking at the downtowner through the Aspen gets us their focus. We're coming back April 1st with a thorough analysis of, you know, limits and all these things, and Lynn is going to go through those in a lot of details, but just to know that we have collected feedback from 6 service area expansion suggestions, and this is done through surveys and focus groups and a lot of outreach. And although we're only through 2 of the 3 sessions, we've gotten a lot of valuable feedback, and I thought that I'd share a little bit of that feedback with you just to give you some kind of idea of maybe some of the decisions that you'll make tonight. I think one of the more interesting pieces that we've received feedback on, and this really came from a lot of focus groups, is they really like the approach of a holistic process that looks at traffic demand management as a whole. And they really like this process of trying to use the public input and put in a sound plan together. And what they caution on, what their concern is kind of a silver bullet solution where you just try to pick on one thing to solve all the answers without knowing the cause and effect of everything together. It's interesting to start to get that kind of feedback from the community. It's pretty dialed in. They really want those broader goals to be dialed in. And so Lynn and I have worked pretty hard to try to get these goals starting to dial in a little bit before you start to pick out little pieces of it. Secondly, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest in further utilizing microtransit for first and last mile connections. And there's also the other segment of the population that has concerns that this may increase congestion at the entrance, and that there could be an impact to some businesses, and that it could be contributing more to environmental aspects. The other thing to keep something in mind, this is just a high-level look at this. is there's concern that they start to lose the quality of level of service the more that you expand. So obviously, you either have to supplement, you have to balance this out a little bit as you make decisions. And Lynn's going to run through a lot of this now since she is the expert. And so I'll give it to you now.
Thank you. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. The 1 minute history of microtransit in Aspen that I'll give you is typically, as you see microtransit develop across the country, it's used as a complement in some way to fixed route transit. So that can look like service in an area where there maybe is no transit, service during certain hours where there's no transit, or in some communities as a replacement for fixed route transit that is perhaps poorly utilized. How that service came about in Aspen was a little bit different. Our council at the time, back in 2015, 2016, was looking for a service that would reduce short trips specifically between nearby neighborhoods and the downtown core, and also in the same, along the same lines, reducing parking occupancy in the downtown core. So with that in mind, we put out an RFP in 2016, hired a company known as the Downtowner Group. And since that time, we've put out additional RFPs, our most recent in 2023. Downtowner selected again as that vendor to provide that service through as long as 2028 at council's direction. Thank you. And this is our current service area. It's not changed much since 2016, and it was put in place again with those original service goals of serving those shorter trips between nearby neighborhoods and downtown specifically. Also, when we think about service area, we're looking at what we call the level of service, which generally means how quickly someone receives service once they've put a request into Downtowner. We want to see that be less than 15 minutes. It averages in 2023 closer to 9 minutes, and we want to keep that service a high quality. We want to look at the cost and efficiency. So as Pete suggested, if we expand the service area, we may need to add more drivers or vehicles. And is that the best use of our funds? And then finally, private provider input. We have tried to listen to some of our local transportation providers and have a service area that is comfortable for them as well. We gave it to you in 5 minutes. And then we just wanted to open it up to questions for you. If you have any input on the original or potential new goals for our microtransit service, does that original goal still resonate with this council that many years later? And then additionally, any input on service span, which means hours of service, or service area, or other thoughts as we continue reviewing strategies through our planning process.
You want these answers now or at the end?
Anytime you'd like. We will be back April 1st to talk to you more about our planning process and what we've heard from the community. But if you have thoughts you'd like to give us now, we're happy to hear them.
I'll leave it up to Tori.
Were you going to share any preliminary feedback, input, public tonight, or no?
No, not
Okay.
until April 1st. I just wanted to give you a general sense of some of the items that related directly to the Downtowner.
Before we get into can you maybe, and maybe you can't, maybe this is an April 1st thing, but, you know, we are still in Aspen. Aspen routes, I believe, are still down 30% pre-COVID numbers. If you look in the downtown core, I think you see more bicycles and e-bikes than previous years. We Cycle, I would say, has both wheels under them now and are getting a lot of use. So I guess all of that's just to kind of set up my question for you, which is, are we seeing very different transit patterns? And maybe you don't know that now, and but I'm just, you know, are you seeing it? Are some of the other areas that you're collecting data in and observations that you're making, do they support that? Is that something that's happening?
Do you want me to take that? Yes, is my short answer. I think, as you know, as the RAFTA board member, that fixed route ridership is not coming back as quickly as we would hope. That peak in 2019, which I think was almost 1.5 million riders, we're not getting back to that. We're under 1 million at this point. We are climbing. When you look at 2021, we've grown in 2022 and 2023, so we're growing year by year, but we're not back to that 1.5 million. There's a lot of theories about why that is the case. Did people leave? Have people's jobs changed? That's the piece that I don't think we know for sure, but we do know that that fixed route ridership has not rebounded as quickly. Downtowner has rebounded to fairly close to 2019, and WeCycle, as you probably all know, has grown exponentially. So you could assume that more people are using bicycles and less people are riding transit. I think the question is why. We haven't really changed our route structure, our hours, or anything like that related to fixed routes. So it's not that the service has changed, but the riders have not come back as quickly as we would hope.
And then a lot of times when we talk about this, we talk about cost per rider mile kind of thing. Is that still our primary metric when we look at effectiveness or efficiency? And that kind of leads to my question is about the routes that we have. So for example, Cemetery Lane has a bus route service. And so we have not really looked, and I say we, just previous councils and stuff, haven't really looked at areas like that as kind of going into with this other microtransit, because we feel like it's fairly well served by a fixed route. And I don't know if they're on the half hour or 20-minute over there, but
It's half hour.
it is half-hour service over there. So are we looking at that whole picture when we're talking on April 1st? Because, for example, the West End, gosh, what was it, 2 years ago, I believe, maybe it was just last winter, we had some service issues because of bus driver shortages, and so we were not able to run the West End or Crosstown, maybe it was,
Correct.
that route, and we had a few residents over there that noticed it, were impacted by it, so we did our best to kind of handle them on a one-to-one basis and say, look, here's the solutions that are probably going to work best for you. But April 1st, are we going to have that larger picture question about some of our current routes, coverage, and the gaps?
Exactly.
Great. Okay, all right. Thank you for that. Let's see. I'll answer these real quickly and then just open it up to everybody else. The original goal still resonates with one exception. New goals. I would love to see this microtransit be more a part of supporting our mass transit system. I continually think about places like Mountain Valley. I think I'm thinking of the right one. There's a bus stop down at the very bottom, but the residences and the homes that are up top there, I mean, it'd be a challenge somewhat to access that bus stop. And so for me, microtransit is that first and last mile solution that I would like to see incorporated into the goals a little bit stronger. Not just about eliminating those downtown car trips and perhaps leaving parking open, but also an additional goal for me would be to be supportive of mass transit through the microtransit. And then I forget what the last thing on there was, but it's all good. Bless you.
I'm happy to jump in whenever.
Sam, let's start at your end.
You went back to me, thank you. First off, I wanted to ask, that ride service Rove never did happen, did it?
Not to our knowledge.
Not to your knowledge, I
Yeah.
wasn't sure if it was.
We were
in
just
peer
looking online over X Games trying to find it, and it does not look like it launched.
review. Do you know?
I cannot confirm it was Rove, but there was a share ride advertised-based presence. They had about 10 to 12 vehicles wrapped in red and white. I don't know, though, if it was Rove or a different provider for that, but it was not one of the major ones that you currently.
I think that was the X Games sponsor shuttle. It was wrapped in red and white, and it was like a skincare.
Oh, yeah.
Brand.
Fairs.
Okay.
I'm not sure it was a share ride thing. I think they were just.
Really,
trying
you think they
mobile
were just
billboards.
trying to? Okay, so this is the backstory is that I was on Craigslist looking for something and I always look at what the gigs are in Aspen because it tells me a lot about what might be happening in town.
You're not busy enough. You need more jobs.
You know, this is while I'm multitasking, watching Will Ferrell movies. So they were paying substantial amount of funds to wrap your car and drive around, and you did occasionally pick up passengers. I don't know if they were any passengers or designated passengers.
I guess the moral is like there is no other rideshare service that's year-round like Downtowner is. And with that, I'd like to concur with Tori that I do think it should be a first last mile sort of thing. So you'll come back to us on April 1st. I look forward to hearing that feedback. But in the meantime, the way I look at it is I don't understand why we would expand it unless we were going to neighborhoods that were hard to reach by our fixed bus service. Like I wrote Williams Ranch, Silverlode, McSkimming, Roaring Fork Drive, Sneaky Lane, and Harbor Lane. Those are not easily accessed by the bus, so I can see the Downtowner going to those spots. But if the Downtowner went to Hunter Creek or Centennial, or Hunter Creek for me, Galena Street Shuttle, Hunter Creek Bus, and then the Downtowner, it would just seem excessive to me, especially when we talk about money and resources. So and if we are going to expand it, which I'm not in favor of necessarily, then I do feel like we almost need to do it, everything in the city of Aspen inside the Castle Creek Bridge. Otherwise, we are gonna start doing things piecemeal, which I'd rather do piecemeal because it like logically makes more sense. But otherwise, I think those are like the options of keeping it exactly the same as is, piecemeal, or entire city of Aspen inside the Castle Creek Bridge. But for me, piecemeal makes the most sense for that first last mile business. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. John?
Yeah, I think this is an important component of our downtown transportation system. I agree with what's been said up here about it being more of a first and last mile thing instead of duplicating routes that already exist. I look forward to April 1st to see what you bring back. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll just go in order. Ward?
Yeah, April 1st, you're going to be getting us there. Is that what, get us there? You're going to go through that as a holistic approach to the solution? Okay, that's good. And when you're talking about 1.5 million ridership for fixed route, that's for the circulator, the Aspen circulator?
Would be for Aspen's route,
Okay, yeah, I saw
Cemetery
the
Lane,
raft was
Castle
back
Maria.
up to 5 million for their.
Yeah, correct. So that doesn't include the Raft Valley service. That's just the Aspen local
Okay.
routes.
And I would be interested in discussing expanding particularly Hunter Creek and Centennial. We have a number of older people that live up in those areas that would benefit from being able to go to the grocery store and not having to lug their groceries back on a bus and schlep them up to where they live. And I've had people express a desire for a downtowner to be available to them. And looking out in the audience, I think we should also discuss how this impacts, in 2016, there was a big concern by High Mountain Taxi and how it affects their ridership and what the demand for their rides were. I think in the interim, I've heard that that was an area that was not some of the routes that they weren't concerned with, but at April 1st, I'd like to get feedback from the local taxi service to see what kind of impact this has on local business, transportation business.
And not only that, but if you could also maybe check in with them, they might have some suggestions about where this service would be beneficial.
Yes.
Thanks, Ward.
And
Oh, yeah.
one more thing, Colombo. The funding for this, is this from parking fees or, please tell us where the funding's coming from?
Well, it comes from the transportation and parking budget. Or are you talking downtowners specifically? Yeah, this is the transportation, and a portion of it, it could come from the parking revenue.
So the revenues for this fund come from three sources. The first is a dedicated sales tax that you have here in the community. The second is, actually, I think you have two, but we treat them as one in budgeting. But you have a dedicated sales tax. You have, every year, you authorize a transfer from the parking fund into the transportation fund. And that is primarily both paid parking and fines. That funds that. The third one is this fund has been the recipient of substantial support from the federal government. It passed through the state, particularly during the COVID time period, and is often, we are a prime candidate for grants, being a large rural system. Just, it's a demographic, so to speak, in the portfolio of those grants they're not able to hit very often, so they're usually pretty excited to work here.
Yeah, and on April 1st, I'd like to see, as Tori pointed out, the trends, the ridership on the downtowner. I think it was 478 million since 2016 or something, and just, that number jumps in my mind, but,
On Downtowner,
yeah,
it's about 480,000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
since 2016.
2016. 75,000 a year? No.
In general, yes.
Yeah, in general,
With the peak
about
again being in
75.
2019.
And no offense, but if John Kruger were here, he'd have the Excel spreadsheet in his mind of how much it costs for passenger miles for each of these different.
Thanks, Ward. Bill?
Thanks. Thanks for bringing this to us. I know it's in advance of when you wanted to present this holistically, which I understand and agree with. I think there's some small adjustments that I was anxious to make when we were talking about their contract, and this has taken a while to come back to us, but I do appreciate the notion of wanting to do it holistically. That being said, there are a couple things I sort of want to talk about the downtowner and how it works for me and many that I know. Firstly, I think it's a phenomenal service that has worked really well for Aspen. That $480,000 number demonstrates that it's being utilized heavily, and I think could be even used more heavily, and it really solves a need in our community. I use all of our forms of transit in Aspen, and I use them a lot. Like, I use Downtowner a lot. I use WeCycle a lot. I use the bus. I drive my own car. I ride my own bike. I'm using all of these things. There are different use cases for each of them. WeCycle, obviously you can't use that right now, so that's not part of the equation on a day like today. Downtowner fits a really important lifestyle need for people who live close to the core of Aspen. Ward mentioned the grocery use case. That's a great one. Going out for dinner or to an event when you're dressed up, like, my wife is not walking to and from the bus when she's dressed up in high heels. It's just not happening. And so the option then is to drive our car, take up a parking space, be drinking and driving, and Downtowner really helps solve for a lot of that. And I think it's a really critical part of the Aspen experience that could be expanded on and is important. Also, if you're with a group, like, groups generally don't take buses together. If you're 4 or 6 people, you don't really walk to and from the bus. It's just, for whatever reason, I've noticed that human dynamic, it's like, I don't know if it's an economic thing or just a human dynamic thing, like, you're finding some other way there. So I really think we have to think of this in the context of lifestyle and how it fits nicely into lifestyle. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve for all things, nor should it. But it's really important, and I think it adds a lot to Aspen and does relieve a lot of pressure on downtown parking, does help eliminate some impaired driving, and solves for some services that aren't meeting the need. High Mountain Taxi, great asset for our community, doesn't fully satisfy the need, couldn't possibly satisfy the need. Uber isn't here year-round. When it's here, these guys are coming up from elsewhere. I talk to them. I take them their cars sometimes. they're coming up from elsewhere and sleeping in their cars at the Intercept lot for a few hours and just coming on peak weekend activity, mostly satisfying tourists. Like, often you'll order the Uber, you'll walk up to the car, they'll try to renegotiate the rate with you before they'll take you anywhere, especially at night. It's not a good feeling. It doesn't reflect well on Aspen. Downtown, I think the point is downtown is a critical component for Aspen, and it's not serving everybody right now within the city limits, like Sam alluded to. And I know it's hard to solve for all of that, but I would like to look at it. And there are some areas on the map that aren't in the city limits right now that maybe we should also examine. South 7th Street all the way to the end there, that's in the county. Does the county want to participate in this? If not, should we be providing that service there? And then, I might be the only one who's interested in this, but I do think the hours of operation are something worth looking at as well, particularly the evening hours. I think the morning hours are fine, maybe even could start a little bit later. I think they're starting at 8 right now.
In the winter, yes.
Yeah, the gondola is not even open at 8, so where is it being used at 8 o'clock? I don't know what that 8 to 9 use period looks like, but maybe it's worth looking at that data. But really, nighttime, I think, is important. If I can only get to town one way, then getting home becomes an issue and maybe incentivizes me to drive. I'm not talking about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, but maybe it's 12 or 1, or maybe it's just on the weekends. I'm not going far enough, nor are most of the people who are using downtown or would be using downtown or in the evenings I don't think, and of course High Mountain can weigh in on this, but I don't think I'm meaningfully affecting their bottom line with my $8 trip. But I think it really would change the equation for me to have a reliable way to get home after I've taken the downtown or into town one way. So I wanted to sort of share my emotional attachment to it and my use case and explain my reasons, but I think let's look at where it makes sense within the city limits to expand this service to physically, and then also on the time side into the evenings a little bit. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. So we're looking forward to April 1. Thank you for joining us tonight to kind of get the preliminary on this. I think that's it.
That's it. Sorry about my computer tripping out.
Doing great. I appreciate you.
Thankfully, it was a short list of questions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, with that, I want to say thank you to GrassRoots. We do have a scheduled regular meeting tomorrow at 5, so if you have comments for council, please join us here at City Hall at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you so much.